So this is quite a shift in how we're running things. Rather than a technical presentation, we're going to settle in and do a couple of panels. The first panel is going to look at the future of mining in the Yukon and what it might look like in the context of post-Eagle world, and some of the broader national and international things that are happening between conflicts and tariffs and new legislation from Ottawa. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge we're on the traditional territories of the T'an-Quechin Council and the Kwanlin-Dun First Nations. We have 3 panelists for this first event. I'll briefly introduce them, but then maybe each of them are going to talk for 10 minutes or so on their particular areas. And if you want to elaborate on your introductions or correct anything I get wrong, please go ahead. So we're going to start on my far right with Kyler Mullet. He's an economist with the Department of Finance, and his primary presentation is going to be to talk about the last economic outlook for the Yukon. And to be fair, just to cut him some slack, as people know, with the current state with the government and no ministers yet, he's not at liberty to speculate going forward, but he can certainly answer questions about what the government's outlook was 6 months ago, 7 months ago. Yeah. So that's Kyler. In the middle, if you were here earlier this afternoon, the other 2 characters have been up here a couple of times, but Kent Bretzlav is the executive director of YESIB, and he's going to share some of his insights into how the evolving regulatory regime, and in particular YESIB's role, is going to maybe change and grow over time. He talked a little bit earlier this afternoon about some of that evolution and some updating of rules, and he can elaborate on that. And then Darren Lease, on my immediate right, is a lawyer. He's been working in the Yukon for over 30 years. He's a member of T'an-Quechin First Nation, and most recently, he's been heavily involved in the development of new mining legislation as required under the DTA. So he's going to talk about some of his insights and experiences through that. So I'll pass it over maybe to Kyler first, and you can get us rolling.
Hello. Oh, that's good. Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me here. First of all, like Carolyn was saying, we're kind of in a tricky bit right now because we're in between governments, so I can only talk about our March forecast and public information. That's okay. I'll give you a little peek behind the curtain of how you can do an economic outlook presentation should you ever have to do it. The trick is you tell people that you're talking about the future, but what you actually talk about is the recent past. And then what you do is you kind of give hand-wavy things about the future. You say, oh, we expect this to continue, or this should probably moderate, or my favorite is, it's too early to tell whether this will continue or moderate. So the people you really want to hear from are these 2 here. So if you really want to know about the future of mining in the Yukon, you don't want to talk to the economists, you want to talk to the lawyers and the regulators. From my perspective, everything's good. I mean, gold is at $4,000, silver's at $50, interest rates are falling, you got low oil prices. I don't know what more you can ask from the economists for all this, other than an explanation for why that happened. If I was, in terms of the gold and silver prices, I've heard 2 explanations, neither of which are particularly persuasive to me. To you, it might be different. One is that it is an old one. A typical one is a safe haven. There's lots of tumult in the world because of the tariffs and whatnot, and so people are flocking to gold because of a safe haven status. That doesn't seem to make sense, just given how the rest of the financial markets are going. In terms of everything else is going good. Normally, if you saw that, you'd see more volatility elsewhere. You're just not seeing that. So the second explanation sometimes you hear is that it's a quasi gold standard thing. So you have, because Russia's cut out from international systems, and you have all these people that can't access normal channels, they're going through commodity markets. There's some too. So back when China still has it, but China had these, they have capital controls, and so you can't easily take your money out from China. And so what some people would do to sort of get around that, they'd buy up copper and stuff like that. And so this kind of mechanism does happen, and it does influence prices. I just don't see why it would be happening so much like since August, excuse me, when we really see this big. It doesn't make sense given the big increase. So the correct answer is I don't know. So the only information I've given you so far is 2 spot prices, but that's okay. Maybe I can switch into something a little bit more meaty. So if you really wanted to go into the economics and say, okay, I want to find something bad. There's got to be something here that's bad. You talk about tariffs. And it's certainly not good, especially for Canada. It's causing, it's causing an economic slowdown. For Yukon in particular, for our mining sector, it's a much less of an issue. So for a couple of reasons. First, in terms of gold is a non-issue altogether because it's trivially simple to go around the tariff wall, right? Like you can fit $4 million worth of gold in your carry-on luggage, and so it's not. It's just it's easy to get around that. So the place where where it could impact is for some of the lower value to transportation cost stuff. For instance, for instance, so our only U.S. export right now is from basically. I mean, it's about a little over 90% is from the Keno Hill mine. So they send their lead silver concentrate to Skagway and then down to Washington and over to Asia. And so that's not subject to the tariff because it's a re-export. Ditto with their zinc. Their zinc comes is combined with their output from their Green Creek mine and then onto further markets in Asia and back into Canada. And so that hasn't impacted them yet, and probably not because it's not entering into U.S. For U.S. consumption. If you look at Hecla's financial documents on this, they say the same thing. They say that the tariffs haven't materially impacted them, and so that's not. And so maybe you could be getting some sort of an uncertainty thing on investment. Certainly, some of the other things. So like there's a couple flavors of tariffs. So you have the 10%, 25% tariffs. The Liberation Day and the fentanyl, and then you also have these 232 tariffs, so-called, because of the national security exemptions. That's the one that's on like aluminum and special ones on copper. So the most relevant one for us would be the copper one. Even there, we're not really hit because it's mostly for refined products. So the aim of these tariffs is to have more processing done in the United States. So they're just not targeting the concentrate. Concentrate isn't covered. So there's no risk there. Some of the other stuff that's happened since could arguably good in terms of changes in policy since Trump and in response to Trump. There's some things that might. There's definitely been a focus from that administration on Alaska. Some of the things, building the Ambler Road and changes to permitting in the U.S. could increase activity there. And with as you see with Keno, there's some synergies between the two places. So more there is probably good for things here. Obviously here and we have C5, and those guys will talk about it because it's the Building Canada Act, and so there's actions in Canada to sort of try and shore up the permitting issue. We'll see how all that plays out. I can't. It's way too controversial for me to talk about. These guys can handle that stuff. Where was I here? So from my mind, the risk is basically materialized. Anything that's going to happen has mostly already happened in terms of the Trump stuff. You might see some little thing. The big thing to look for now would be the CUSMA renegotiation. So that's the Canada, U.S., Mexico free trade agreement that should happen next year. That might lead to something. But for the most part, all the uncertainty that we thought back when I was doing the outlook in March, it was like every single day there was something different from the Trump administration. There's definitely lots of stuff. That's all sort of settled down now. And given where things are going in terms of, and you'll stop me if I'm going way too long, right? Okay. Given where things are going here with the, I lost my own train of thought here. Given where things are going with the Trump administration, so I mean, he's losing. They have the midterms next year. They had a big court decision or court hearing with the Supreme Court. That's odds on it's gonna invalidate some of these tariffs. If you go on Polymarket right now, I think it's a 75% chance that the Supreme Court strikes those down. And so I think any of the real bad stuff that might happen, we kind of already know about. And so I think, given that we're not really impacted by what's been out so far, we should be out of the woods in terms of the tariff stuff. And so that means it's just good news again. In terms of our forecast, my forecast was done in March, so it's all it's not very useful. But so we had it for our placer mining. We expected that to come, the placer production to come down. Now they boosted those. Because of the water licenses. The water site licenses were all expiring, and so we expected production to stop because of that. Now since our forecast came out, they temporarily extended all those licenses, and so they've gone, it's been a very good year for placer miners, so we're gonna have to revise that. The other one, as I've kind of talked about, is the Keno Hill. Now they've obviously enjoyed the silver going up. There's some risky kind of, we had downside risk there has subsided a bit because silver's at $50, and so some of the things that you kind of get worried about at a $25 silver, you're not so worried about at $50 silver. And so I think there it's in terms of their actual production, they're up a little bit, and obviously their revenues are up a whole bunch because of the higher price. So that part's good. Now we specifically in our forecast didn't talk about the Eagle Gold sale because we didn't want to speculate on it one way or the other, and that's nothing there has changed. The only thing I can feel free to pass on to y'all is that it's easier to sell a gold mine when the gold prices are at $4,000 and when they're at $3,000. So if you think in terms of Eagle Gold, their all-in sustaining costs for 1 ounce of gold when they closed was about $1,700. Gold prices at that time was about $2,300. They're making a gross margin of $600 per ounce. Now they're, with $4,000 gold prices, that's $2,300 if my math is right. That they're making, so that's 4 times as much that they would, that whoever buys the thing, if they buy the thing and they're allowed to produce, if that happens, they'll be making that much, and if gold prices stay the same anyhow. You see my point, is that the prices have gone up by 2, but the potential margins have gone up by 4 times, right? And so just as get winding down here on the conclusion, it makes it tough. So a lot of times I get asked about, okay, well, what's the economic impact of this mine or on the on the economy? What's the impact of mining and whatnot? And it's a simple question, but a very tough answer to sort of get at. And one of the reasons is at $2,000, Eagle Gold's probably bad for the economy. But at $4,000, it could potentially be good for the economy. And so it all depends on that price. And another problem with that question is just that it not only is it oversimplification, it's also overcomplicated, in the sense that the value of a gold mine is the gold it produces. If it doesn't get the gold, there's no point in having it, right? And so it's looking, oh well, what about the royalties and the jobs and all this stuff? But really, fundamentally, what's most important is that main piece there. It's a gold mine, so it needs to produce gold, and if gold is worth more, it's going to be more valuable for the economy than if it's not. And so the trick is to make sure that gold that they're making enough money to pay their investors back, and making enough more than that to compensate for to the rest of society for hosting them and for meeting some of the bearing some of the risk, and then also fundamentally that there's some mechanism in place to be able to compensate, to actually do the compensation, and that's sort of where the regulatory piece and some of the other social license pieces come in. And so, please, Kent.
Wow, thank you.
That was pretty rapid fire.
That is going to be, yes. That's going to be exceptionally hard to follow up on, especially when you're talking about YESIB. So here we go. So yeah, kind of my goal here is just to paint the reality of what my world looks like for you all, because I think the best way to kind of predict what's going in the future is explaining and kind of living the current. So for those that don't know, YESIB is born from Chapter 12, so it's negotiated through the UFA and then into federal legislation that is YESA. We opened 20 years ago, this November, so a birthday party coming up for us. We're applicable on all lands in the territory. We're independent, we're not a regulator. We don't have compliance abilities, and we also don't monitor. So what do? We provide recommendations that are required before permitting commences. And we do recommendations on environmental and socioeconomic aspects of things that people care about. And counter to you, we only look at significant adverse effects. So we're not looking at how much the project is worth, how much it's going to be worth in 10 years. We don't have economists on staff. We're just looking at the negatives or potential adverse effects. So what are we seeing? There is a commodity boom, as Skylar just kind of outlined. What that means for us is actually almost the same amount of projects coming in from year to year, but that's still a lot. That's about 270 a year. And they're complex. There's some are renewals, some are new. And that's kind of status quo for us. But what is different is kind of this broader conversation around them. So I'm in a lot of meetings, transboundary with NWT, trying to figure out what that looks like with Canada, talking about kind of global priorities. I don't know, in my career that's new, and I think that will continue, knowing what Yukon possesses in its subsurface. Another big thing, growing population. I think within the last year, we've probably had, don't quote me on this, but up to 10 Yukon energy projects separately in process. Some of those renewals, so we're expecting them. Some of them are also to expand production. And I think that's a big question that we're all faced with, like how are we going to keep the lights on? How are we going to keep it warm? For us, that's a hard conversation when we're only looking at significant adverse effects. And that's a very hard one for all our assessors to handle. But I think that really highlights just we are growing so fast and we're trying to keep up. And YESIB is having those conversations on many different projects. Many varying expectations. That's probably always been the case, but we definitely have projects that are being highlighted more in the public realm. I'll use Gladiator Metals. Recently, we issued that recommendation. I think we had 109 separate comments. And it was very interesting to review those comments for myself because usually we have the standard governments are inputting and they have their standard kind of rhetoric. But this one had a whole slew of different types of comments pro-industry, pro-economy, no mining in our backyards. It had everything in there. And that was just a very interesting project to kind of highlight that polarizing view of the growing population in the territory. Exceptionally strong Yukon First Nations with constitutionally protected rights. And Darren can speak to this way better than I would ever attempt to. But from my point of view, I'm seeing like in the last 9 years, I've seen this increase in amazing submissions to our process that are extremely weaving between knowledge since time immemorial, and then legally the ability to ensure their voice and rights are protected in a system that YESIB is comprehending that doesn't have all the checks and balances to uphold that. So I think that's a big thing that we face moving forward. I often we get everything submitted into YESIB, and everything basically, especially the things that can't get some consensus in the general conversations or in government-to-government dialogues, because we don't have a duty to consult, but our process is relied upon, so we get it all there. And it's very hard because we don't have the tools fully implemented in this territory for us to do our mandate. Land use planning is a good example of that one. We're supposed to be doing conformity checks with the commission that's not active for the land use plans that are in place. And I think with Dawson in his draft stages and land use planning happening in Natural Duns territory, moving forward with that conversation is a huge opportunity for us to be able to administer our mandate. We need to adapt because just everything is changing. So that's why we are doing rules reviews. That's why we're adding staff, reimagining staff. We're still committed and required to be a decentralized model. So we have offices in 6 different districts across the territory. That's always how we're going to be, but we need to be able to adapt to be tuned into our districts more because they are evolving so quickly as well. And we can't just be seen as suits that are sitting in Whitehorse. Not that we are, but we need to keep working on that. And I think we'll always be working on that. So that's kind of what we're seeing in general. I am just going to explain an assessment quickly because I just want to kind of explain why they are so thorough, because quite often that's the conversations I'm having, like, why are you digging into this? Like, what is YESIB doing? You cost us X amount of dollars last year because we had to do all this stuff. So at a high level, we receive a proposal from proponents, we do a technical review, we have a public comment period, and then we provide a recommendation. And that recommendation can be for the project to proceed with terms and conditions, do not proceed, or refer it up to an upper level of assessment in some cases. What those recommendations house are terms and conditions, and those are mitigations to address potential significant adverse effects of the project. And we get those from the proposal, commitments from the proponent, but then also from the public comment periods. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of change in the recent years too, is those calls coming through the comments are growing and growing, are more polarized. So that's making it very interesting for us to navigate. And that's why our recommendations are so thorough. That's why we have so many pages, because we're hearing so much. And that's why we're here. We're not here to slow process. We're also not here to make sure it flies through. We're here to be that neutral body in the territory that can take in all the voices and make a recommendation that's independent from governments, that respects the spirit and intent of the Umbrella Final Agreement, while promoting sustainable development in the territory. So that's kind of our realm, and that's what we're faced with day to day, which personally makes it very exciting for me to go to work. And we have so many evolving conversations, kind of those things that I highlight. So I think I'll stop there because we will dig into like more of the geopolitical, bigger Canadian context, but I just wanted to lay the land for a day in YESIB.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel. I've been asked today to talk about mining in the Yukon and what it looks like in a changing world. What I want to do first, though, is sort of go back before we look forward. Let's look back where we've been and the tremendous journey that we've been on for the last 30 years. For people that have lived in the Yukon for 30 years or more, there's been tremendous change here. Not just a growing population, but probably more change, I suspect, in the Yukon than any other province or territory in Canada. We've had devolution happen. We had oil and gas transfers in the late 90s. So transferring authority, including legislative authority, from Ottawa to the territorial government. And then in 2003, we signed off a tripartite agreement which would transfer legislative authority for lands, waters, minerals, forestry to the Yukon government from Canada. So prior to that, all those decisions were effectively made in Ottawa by bureaucrats and ultimately approved by a minister who was not in any way accountable to Yukoners. We truly were managed and governed like a colony. Due to issues about transparency, accountability, local management, devolution made a tremendous amount of sense for the Yukon. There was a lot of hesitancy on the First Nation side to empower the Yukon government with that authority at that time, because we were in the midst of contentious negotiations with land claim agreements. There wasn't a great trust relationship. I do find it interesting when I look back at those negotiations on devolution at that time. The Yukon government had an appetite also for devolution of the YESA functions, right? And for that legislation to become territorial legislation. But at the same time as that was happening, we were negotiating land claims agreement. People are familiar with the Umbrella Final Agreement that was signed off in 1993, and then the first 4 agreements came into legal effect in 1995 when settlement legislation was passed by Parliament. And then there was a whole series of agreements. Selkirk and Little Samak signed off their agreements, and they came into effect in 97, Trondek in 98, Ton in 2000, and then Kwanlundun, Carcross, Klawani First Nation as well. So over a period of approximately 10 years after a lengthy process of the UFA, we had 11 of the 14 First Nations self-governing. So the 3 First Nations weren't self-governing. People are aware, White River First Nation, Ross River Dana Council, and Liard First Nation. That's a fundamental shift. We have more, across Canada, there's less than 30, maybe there's 26, 27 nations in Canada, First Nations in Canada, who are self-governing. 11 of them are here. So we have the highest concentration of self-government. I won't talk much about the self-government agreements, except to say that they have greater legislative authority. Our laws that we enact under those agreements are paramount to the territorial laws. There's a lot of authority that First Nations haven't yet exercised. There's all sorts of arrangements for justice, for tax. We have tax sharing agreements with YG and the Government of Canada. We have justice agreements we're negotiating with Canada and YG. We have financial transfer agreements that we have with the Government of Canada. Those are all ancillary to the actual self-government agreement that sets out our lawmaking powers. It's interesting because at this time in 2003, right in the midst of all this negotiation, transforming the Yukon's political, legal landscape, devolution happened, and the Yukon government now had this jurisdiction for various matters, including minerals. First Nations agreed to support devolution. I was part of those negotiations more than 20 years ago on conditions. And one of those conditions was, listen, if you're going to have authority over legislation for minerals, we're only going to agree to it if we're developing new legislation, made in Yukon legislation, together. Because it was simply, under the devolution agreement, a rollover of the existing federal laws. We basically mirrored them as territorial legislation on April 1st, 2003. So they came into legal force, and at that same date, they were repealed from Ottawa. The problem with that legislation, of course, is it had been in force, in some cases, from the 1920s and hadn't changed in any real substantive way. And there was a real need to update, modernize, of course, and we needed the time to do it in a way that truly addressed Yukon needs. That work is still outstanding. 20 years plus since devolution happened, we have one statute that we were able to develop, which was a forestry legislation that came into effect in 2008. And now we're working on lands legislation, but primarily on mineral legislation. That work is outstanding. It is interesting if you look back at when devolution happened, and I understand the reasons why. It's not necessarily because the governments didn't want to deal with new legislation. Perhaps that was the case for some, I don't know. But it didn't happen, and I attribute one of the reasons why is a lot of people look at First Nations and from proponents' point of view, as well as governments, that we don't have the capacity to carry out our functions. And I think that's correct. There is a capacity shortfall. I think we'd all recognize that. But at the same time, I think people don't understand that Yukon government has the same capacity issues. On April 1st, 2020, or April 1st, 2003, they had all this new responsibility for enacting laws, doing monitoring, doing inspections on lands, waters, mining, and everything else. The deal they got from from Canada for devolution was, what was it, 45 million at the time for them to deliver those programs. About 240 jobs were transferred from Canada to YG. A lot of the federal employees, not all of them, but a significant amount of them, decided to stay with the feds. They didn't want to transfer over. So you had a lot of loss of experience on an operational side. And I think that has led to a lot of problems. We've been to the Supreme Court of Canada on mining matters in the CarMax case versus Paulson around consultation. And there's some real issues there about the duty to consult and how that's carried out. And that's had a profound impact on the self-governing First Nations about their relationship with the Yukon government. We're sitting on the sidelines going, listen, you're screwing up your duty to consult. You're not enacting legislation with us as we committed to do under the devolution agreement. And that's had a big impact for many years in the Yukon. More recently, we've had the Liberal government, when they were initially enacted, they entered into a mining MOU with First Nations, which led to the mineral development strategy and some other amendments. And ultimately, when they got reelected, they committed to sit down and start the legislative process for developing new legislation. And that's been really positive. There's a lot of work to be done. I spoke earlier about that today, but some really progressive steps with the industry and also with public government. One of the things also that's changed dramatically in the Yukon is our economy. We still receive the bulk of our money through the formula financing agreement, but there's been changes here that are dramatic. One of the things that a lot of people I don't think realize in the Yukon is during the course of the land claim implementation process, there's been a creation of an entirely new First Nation middle class in the Yukon. It wasn't there in the 1970s. It wasn't there in the 1980s. It's there now for people who were here during that time, I think would agree. And what's also interesting is that First Nations have taken the financial compensation payments that were made under Chapter 19 of their final agreements, and for the most part, everybody, each of the First Nations, has or is in the process of establishing trust to manage that money. And trust is a separate legal entity, separate from the First Nation government. There's trustees who are appointed to manage the money and fulfill the terms of the deed, which in most cases is to grow it, to ensure it's there for benefiting current generations as well as future generations. That money in some cases has grown to hundreds of millions of dollars for some of these First Nations. But unlike a lot of other First Nation groups in Canada, the Yukon First Nations are not just invested in public markets around the world, in diversified portfolios. That's what the majority are, and there's billions of dollars in Canada that First Nations have invested. What First Nations in the Yukon have done, which is different, is they've taken a significant chunk of their money and invested it in the local economy. Things like Air North and Kilrich and Northern Vision's development in the Yukon in all sorts of things, into the Coke distribution, Coca-Cola distribution plant, all sorts of things. And the reason why is because a lot of our citizens said, well, it's great you got $100 million in the bank, but what is that, how's that improving my life? You know, people need to see us not just investing and creating jobs, but also shaping the services that our citizens are getting, particularly in rural communities like Dawson, where my community is. We own 3 of the hotels. They now stay open, or at least one of them is open. Restaurants are open. Services that weren't there before we had ownership. And what that leads to the next point is that the success of the mining industry benefits us. Like, we're now hand in hand with the mining industry. The mining industry drives the economy in the Yukon, the private economy. You stay in our hotels, you fly in our planes, you eat in our restaurants, you shop at our grocery stores, and your success is our success. And I don't know if a lot of people recognize that, but we certainly do. And what's even more interesting is when I was first involved in this process of land claims as a young lawyer in the mid-90s, and I was involved in a handful of land claim negotiations that were Trondeck and Tawn and Carquest-Tagish and a couple others. The real objective at that time was about protecting the land. There wasn't a great relationship, and there wasn't a trusting relationship with mining industry. In fact, it was kind of adverse. People really went to the negotiation table and said, we want protected areas. We want no mining in this area. We want the Tombstone. We want Kuswas parks as special management areas established under Chapter 10. That was the intent at the time. What we've seen since that time is First Nations engaging more with proponents, and I think that's obviously progressive. We've seen that grow, and I'm happy to say I think in most cases it's pretty standard now for there to be impact benefit agreements between proponents and affected First Nations. That's positive. We've seen proponents who have existing claims in traditional territories where there's self-government, where it's not even on settlement land, where the proponent is prepared to share some of the profits. You know, the value of having a social license from the community. That's a big change. You know, now we're starting to see, okay, we're benefiting from these operations for mineral activities and projects through our own companies. And now what you saw last summer is you saw a First Nation take a big step to actually owning a significant quartz property in the Yukon. That's where this is all going. Where it's going is, in the Yukon for mining, is we have to get this new mineral legislation done, and we have to get it done right. We can't have it forced through. We can't take shortcuts. We can't try to pull the eyes over one party or another. We need to ensure that this legislation provides for benefits that for Yukoners, both in the short and long term. We can't afford, we know this, because, you know, it's unfortunate, my colleague can't talk about the impacts of Vic Gold on the economy. But we can't afford to do that anymore, because as a result of devolution, we're responsible for those decisions. We can't afford them anymore. We just can't. That 200 million or whatever is being spent on Vic Gold, I don't like beating up Vic Gold, because I think they went to the community with, in my view, trying to do something creative and progressive, and it didn't work out that way, and I'm not going to make any comment on that. But we can't afford that, because anybody who's driven up and down the Alaska Highway or the Klondike Highway in the last 6 months between like Carmax and Pelly, or Pelly to Stewart Crossing, like, where's our chipper crew, right? You know, I laugh about it, but then I'm also sad because, you know, that money is now diverted from our healthcare, from our school systems, from our infrastructure that really benefit all Yukoners. We can't afford that anymore. So we need to have provisions in place in new mineral legislation that provides for meaningful compliance monitoring enforcement, reclamation, effective security, and we need to do that together as Yukoners. We really do. And we need to ensure that decisions are being made for the issuance of permits, license, and authorizations that deal with reclamation and security and granting of mineral rights. First Nations need to be part of that. There needs to be, it just can't all fall to YESA. As Kent was saying, you know, by default, they're kind of doing consultations, which they're really not well suited for. There's a whole bunch of issues there that need to be sorted out, but we can't afford to fumble another situation in the Yukon, because it's gonna cripple us. And we can't fumble an opportunity, because the opportunity is here right now to get the mineral legislation, get it right. And I think we need to pick up where we were prior to the election. Maybe, you know, there's a new government. We're looking forward to what they have to say. We want to work with the industry. And we think we're at that point now, I can say with my colleagues, because we've had the steering committee involved for a number of years with YG and Yukon First Nations. I was working for CYFN. We had a caucus of more than 20 First Nations that all have Aboriginal rights in the Yukon, including some that are outside the Yukon, like the Inuvialuit, the Gwich'in, Taku-River Tlinkits, Ake, Danicho, others. And people see the opportunity. And we've been waiting a long time. There was, going back what I said earlier, our strategy for the devolution transfer agreement in the late 90s was, A, we wanted to be a party to it, because originally it was just going to be a bilateral agreement between YTG and Canada. And we wanted very specific conditions placed on that transfer. And one of them was for Made in Yukon legislation to be developed collectively by Yukoners, facilitated through a government-to-government process with Yukon First Nations. So where do I see things going in the future? Well, I think there's a bright future there. I'm really optimistic. We really do need to deal with some real tough issues, like the free entry system, which is the heart of the current regime, but that regime is, you know, I'm sorry, but mining isn't the highest and best use of our lands necessarily, which is kind of what the free entry system is based on. There's different ways of doing it. It's going to look different. It may feel different, but I think in the end, it's going to make life better for proponents. There'll be a heck of a lot more certainty if people have clarity about social license earlier in the process, not after they've done a bunch of work and done a bunch of investments. That's going to help us. But we really do need to work together, because I'm not going to be overly dramatic, but I do really feel this way. We can make or break the mining industry with this new mineral legislation, or make and break the Yukon economy. Like I think we're at a real crossroads, and because we cannot afford not just the problems with cleaning up our waste sites and so forth, but I don't think industry can continue to put up with being dragged into court on applications, and it happens, right? We have the peel, we have metallic metals, we have BMC, we have people who are trying to do things the right way and are getting caught up in this stuff because land use planning isn't working, because the land claiming agreements haven't been negotiated in this territory and that territory. But maybe we can make some significant headway with new mineral legislation. And that's certainly the position of the people I work for and report to at Council Yukon First Nations, wanting to get back, reconvene that work, roll up our sleeves, get busy with the industry and environmental groups and all Yukoners, and make something that unique that works for all of us. So I wanted to say that today, and I want to be really clear about that. So thank you very much.
That was great. Thanks. So I'll open up the floor for questions, but I just wanted to have a couple of follow-ups based on stuff you said, Darren, but maybe a question for Kyler to put. Like, you mentioned, Darren, that you drive now up to Pelly and the road's in bad shape, and you could attribute some of that at least to the fact that there's maybe thinner coffers at YG, and therefore they're not investing as much in maintaining roads. Do you know offhand how that money's parsed out roughly across different government infrastructure services, health, education? No.
Well,
maybe?
no.
Okay. Okay. Well, that question's easy then.
I probably
Next.
should, but yeah. I mean, his point is correct. The money is, you can only use it for one thing. So if
Yeah.
you're using it to do this thing with Vic Gold, you can't do it. You can't use that money to do other things that you might want to do it with,
Yeah.
right? So.
Yeah. Okay, no, I wasn't sure if those were numbers that you had at your fingertips. So the other question, totally different, but when you talked about the importance of finishing the new mining legislation, so fast forward however many years that will take, if the entire the regulatory process and the approvals and the decisions are being made, in a co-management context instead of YG consulting, do you think that will have a ripple effect on YESIB, and you'll then get fewer comments in the comment period from communities saying, I don't like this, or I'm concerned about that, or what about the carrot? But do you think you'd see those two things?
I'll make a comment, and maybe Kent will have a comment. But I do think, I'm happy you raised that, because right now, because there's so little faith, I think, on the First Nation side, and maybe other Yukoners feel the same way, that once something gets out of YESA and there's a decision document issued, that they don't really have much input into the regulatory system about the issuance of a license and permits. So I think that a lot of the First Nations, a lot of my clients feel that they have to get as much knowledge, as much input in the YESA process. And that's really unfair for proponents in a lot of cases, because they don't go in with a plan that's 100%, right? Especially on the mining side, I'm assuming they're going to go in and say, well, it could change. It could be, the vein could go this way, or the project could change. And people are extending and asking for deadlines on YESA, and it's making it tough on YESA because there's a fear that it's their only opportunity to have any input into what the mitigation could be for that particular project. When in reality, what we really do need is to have a vibrant regulatory side of it, where there is mitigations that can be attached to the licenses and permits issued under the regulatory process as well. YESA is not intended to be the be-all and end-all for everything. It's got a very specific function, and I think it does it well, but a lot is being asked of it. Those are my own thoughts, and I'm sure Kent has his.
I agree with that as well. But I do think, if we do get new legislation and kind of resolution on some of these bigger things in the territory, we may not get less comments, but we we'll be able to do our like mandate more effectively and with more ease. And I think the one thing I really respect from everyone in this territory and afar is that people really do want YESA to work. So that's like very fulfilling, and that comes in different forms. When we were in court last year for Michelle Creek, having like nations stand by our side and like argue that, that was very neat. I have amazing relationships with industry as well, KPMA, Chamber of Mines, individual mining companies that are trying to do the right thing, come to us early, try and figure out how to do it right. And then we also have very unique solutions to these bigger issues in the territory, to a linear assessment process being one with Ross River Denny Council, where there's recognition that YESA will never do everything perfectly in that view. We're never going to be able to be the right people to assess an impact on a right. So is there the ability to create something new in parallel that can feed into our process? And I think that's the exciting parts of moving forward for everyone in this territory, is that there's this core belief, at least in my view, that YESA can work and should work. And we just have to figure out what that looks like in this decade and decades to come.
And Kyler mentioned Bill C-5, that's the Building Canada Act. And just earlier this week, there was an announcement about the transmission line, the connection project to the BC grid. And there's more projects of national interest that are going to be announced over the next however many months. If Yukon had a major mining project, like Mactung is a huge tungsten deposit. It's one of the biggest in the world. It's a critical mineral and a strategic one. We've got Casino. If one of those were to be put onto the list of projects of national interest, the way the process is outlined, at least on Canada's website, is that there's initial consultation and discussion and pretty much approval, and so then the assessment process and the subsequent steps are all about how to make it work, not whether a go, no-go decision. How would that work? How would that work with YESA and your role?
Yeah, I think great question for the current times. And I have met with Major Projects Office just this week, actually, so timely as well. I think the really important thing to highlight is like YESA wasn't included in any of the Building Canada Act appendixes. They recognize that the North is different, that we're processes born from modern land claims, and that we'll be continuing to do our process independently from that. How it'll change things from a YESA point of view is, like, we've received comments and from various different departments of the federal government. They'll be consolidated into one, is my understanding, and kind of streamline in that point of view. I also understand that there's going to be kind of a broader coordination, solo coordination effort from the federal government for a project and for the whole project. What that could look like and this is again just my understanding, is that like if it's a transmission line that's transboundary, it's coordinating like our process with BC and like making sure that it can be effectively put through the process. With you referenced Mactung, that's more transboundary with our colleagues in NWT, and they'll be operating the same as YESA, kind of independent of the BCA, but seeing kind of like that coordinated approach. So it's more up to YESA and Mackenzie Valley Land Water Board and the review board over there to make sure coordination is occurring for effective and timely process. And then for projects fully in the territory, I think we're going to do our thing, and we are adapting our processes currently to make sure we can operate to everyone's expectation currently. So that's kind of what we're doing, but that's independent of any other federal initiative.
So Sue Craig in the front row here has a microphone. Does anybody have any questions from the audience? There's one here, Sue.
I was just wondering, approximate how much money Yukon government has spent on this remedial process so far? Does anyone know?
The what process?
Yeah,
How much money the government has spent on the remedial process for the mine so far?
Oh, for Eagle. That would have been a question for Erin. She's not here anymore, eh?
Yeah, I think I don't know the exact figure, but it's at least in terms of the loans being advanced to the receiver. I think it's 105 million was what we had in the budget. I think it's closer to 200 million at this point, but I wouldn't want to quote an actual number. So somewhere in that ballpark would be what it is, but I don't know.
How much you say?
It's well, at least 105 million and probably quite a bit more.
Any other questions? So I have another one. It's probably mostly for you, Darren, but anybody jump in. So you mentioned another commitment in the umbrella final agreement for land use planning. And even when I was with the Geological Survey, we'd hear comments in communities that, first do land use planning and then look at exploration and development, but that it needed to be sequenced instead of concurrent. Is there some way you could see the two working concurrently so that you can sustain an industry and have the benefits, the economic benefits, the social benefits, and so on, but still advance land use planning?
Yep, thank you. That's a good question. It's certainly something that we've been grappling with when we were talking about developing new mineral legislation. A lot of First Nations rightly will come out and say, well, we want a moratorium in our entire area until land use planning is complete. The Yukon government's been very clear about that for term after term to say, no, we're not prepared to do that. I think that maybe withdrawals of areas where there is general agreement that these are going to be subject to certain terms or conditions under a land use plan may be helpful. The concern, of course, is that if the land remains open and a land use plan is not in place and it takes another 5 or 10 years, that critical areas could be really adversely impacted by mining activities like wetlands. We're all familiar with that and how sensitive that is. But there's a real concern around those type issues. And if they're not resolved, and if land use planning is not implemented, it becomes a problem for other tables. Like, we're trying to do mining legislation, and at the same time, we have to deal with these issues related to land use planning. And I understand the reasons why. It's a challenge. I don't know what the answers are. But certainly we have to address it. Otherwise, if we don't, the land use planning processes in our Chapter 11 are going to be hollow. There's not going to be a lot of land left to plan in as we move the South Yukon down, particularly even through that central area of the Yukon. It's good to see Dawson's land use plan moving, but there's a lot of other contentious areas, and that's impacting our ability to, again, try to create this new constructive relationship between the parties based on new legislation when these other outstanding issues remain unresolved.
Does not having free entry help that? Because people talk about nuisance staking and that stopping land use planning or affecting it if that's, I don't know how much that happens because it's an expensive undertaking, but still there's probably.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about what the alternative to a free entry system would look like. There's been some discussion that perhaps it's an area that's staked. It's not a claim, but it looks like a claim, and that would provide an exclusive right for a proponent to undertake certain exploration activities, and when they reach certain thresholds, then they could apply to get a grant. But even that, it doesn't seem to work in the sense that to address land use planning concerns. Because if somebody does establish one of these areas and does spend money, say a couple $100,000 or a couple million on exploration before they get the grant, you can't take their claim from them, or you can't take that area from them. Otherwise, that's going to kill the industry, right? Like, there'll be that high level of uncertainty. So, it's extremely difficult to navigate through these issues. And maybe this other idea of withdrawals prior to there actually being claims in key areas, maybe that's something. I don't know. The best case scenario is we get land use planning done. Ideally, it should have been done 10 years ago. That hasn't been the case. But it's an issue we're going to have to deal with, and it's a tough issue.
Okay. I guess one problem at a time. So there's 1 minute left. There's potentially time for one more question, or if any of the panelists want to add anything. I mean, I specifically targeted Darren with that question, but anybody else can throw in some thoughts if you have them. No? Any last words, Darren?
Yeah, sorry. I just want to end it on this. Like, I don't want to come across as being opposed to mining, because I'm not. My comments are really about trying to outline the challenges that we have and the opportunity for us to get it right, as I said earlier. So, it's a challenge that we all have as Yukoners, and it's really incumbent upon us to take advantage of that opportunity and see what we can do with it. It'd be a real shame if it washes off to the side, because what we've seen with particularly the courts legislation is there were initiatives for legislative reform in the 50s, went a little ways and fell apart. In the 70s, they actually drafted something to replace the Courts Act. It fell apart. And in the 80s, early 80s, again, nothing happened. We can't let that happen again. Otherwise, it's going to look pretty bleak in the Yukon. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, I think we've got the momentum now, and from what the Premier said the other day, it sounds like it could even happen. So, well, thank you very much, all of you. This was great. Really appreciate it. And we've got another panel coming up, so we'll just do a quick turn over here and move on. Thanks again.